My name is Reggie Jackson, and I'm the chairman of the board of directors for the Dr. James Cameron Legacy Foundation. That's a foundation that's running America's Black Holocaust Virtual Museum online, and also the umbrella organization that is working tirelessly to reopen America's Black Holocaust Museum in a physical facility at some point moving forward. I've been here before, and I'm really happy to be back again. Really excited about this series that I'm doing on the history of race and racism. I think it's very relevant to events that are going on nowadays, and we'll touch on a few of those this evening. Before I get started, I want to see if anyone has any questions of me, anything you guys want to know about me, history, anything like that. Just came back from a wonderful 2-week vacation. My wife and I went on a cruise, so we went to Jamaica, we went to Mexico, met some wonderful people on the cruise ship, spent a week in Miami afterwards. So really got away from this bad weather for a while, reinvigorated myself, and almost feel like I'm in Miami again, just because it hasn't worn off yet. So I'll try to use some of that enthusiasm during the course of this presentation. I'm going to start by showing you guys just some stuff that's happened recently. I'm sure you guys have heard about many of these events. Maybe you haven't heard about all of them. Race-related stuff that's happened in what some people refer to as a post-racial America since I was last in Racine. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled not too long ago that voter-backed affirmative action bans like the one in the state of Michigan are unconstitutional, which means that if you put an initiative on the ballot and the citizens of the state vote to ban affirmative action, it's perfectly okay to do so. So they've opened that floodgate. Michigan had already done it, the law was challenged, and the U.S. Supreme Court says it's perfectly fine to do that. The U.S. Army, even though they're trying to backtrack now, they're going to reconsider this. They changed their policy for hair for females in the military, and they said that females are not allowed to wear braids, afros, or twists in their hair, which basically affects African American women who are in the Army. There's a huge backlash. Several groups have kind of come forward to speak out on behalf of those black women who are in the Army, and the Army is now reconsidering their policy, but they haven't changed it yet. I'm sure you guys have heard of this Nevada rancher who became this semi-celebrity for the conservatives, and of course he stuck his foot a little bit too far in his mouth, said blacks had it better off as slaves, and so they kind of ran away from him after he made those remarks. I know you guys, unless you're on another planet, there's no way you could have not heard about the controversy with Donald Sterling, the owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, making those remarks to his girlfriend in a conversation that was private that she recorded and let the world hear. And of course, our wonderful Congressman Paul Ryan says, recently on a radio interview, he says that we have generations of men not even thinking about working or learning to value the culture of work in our inner cities. So that's kind of where we are. We try to convince ourselves, some of us, I'm not one of those people, try to convince ourselves that we're a post-racial America, that things have gotten so much better, things are so different, but constantly things are occurring on a regular basis that reminds us that we still have a long way to go. So we're going to talk about some of the reasons we've gotten to where we are. I firmly believe this. Racism, racial issues that we have in this country go back a long way. They go back to the basic foundation, the founding of the nation, before it was even thought of as a nation, when it was just English colonies. The idea of race was used to basically change the outcomes of people's lives very early on. And so we're going to look at some of those particular things and talk about this idea of race. Is it a biological entity or is it a socially constructed entity? That's what I want to talk about tonight. So tonight's presentation is about race. What is it? Is it biologically constructed or socially constructed? In 2 weeks I'll be back to do a piece on interpersonal, structural, and institutional forms of racism. Talk about how racism really works, because I think that for the most part, most Americans, we don't have an understanding of how entrenched racism is in our society. We kind of tend to think of racism, the first thought that pops in our minds when we think of racists, we think of neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, and things of that nature. But we're going to look very deeply into the structure and the institutions within our society that really maintain racism and make sure that it doesn't go away anytime in the near future. After that, 2 weeks later, I'm going to do a history of racism in America. So we're going to cover some of those things that have happened historically in the country that have really affected the lives of millions and millions of people. African Americans, the indigenous population of the country, Hispanics, Asian Americans, mostly non-white people, even though there were times where whites got caught up in it because they were not considered white yet. And we'll talk about that. I'll be back in June, 3 dates, June 10th, 17th, and 24th. I'll do a presentation called The Psychological Effects of Racism in 2 parts, because I think it's really, really a very important part of us understanding how racism really has an impact in a way that we can't physically see with our eyes all the time. We can see things like the Donald Sterling, we can hear the tapes, but I'm going to delve into the psyche of America and how these things that have been related to racism over the course of years have really had this huge impact on the psychology of Americans and how they live their lives, how they go about their day-to-day business. I think that's going to be very interesting for you. And then the last presentation I'm going to do in the series is called Anti-Racism Work. What can you do about it? You know, we talk about it all the time, we have these conversations about it all the time, but what can we actually do? What can we as individuals say, okay, tomorrow I'm going to start to do this, or I'm going to do that. So we'll talk about what we can do as individuals to combat racism. And I think that's going to be very, very helpful for each of you. So I want to show you guys this video.
Can you raise it a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Please.
Let me do this. If I can figure out how to raise it. I don't know how to raise this. Well, maybe we can find something to sit underneath it. Oh, there we go. All right, now it's too high.
It's this thing here.
Oh, okay. All right, so that may be good. Yeah, okay, I think that's good. So, let me go back.
What? Why don't you want to turn black? But what'll happen? What's the difference? You will still be able to wear the same clothes, you'll have the same toys, you'll still play with yo-yo, you'll still live here with us. You can ride your bike. You can be our little black bike rider. Listen, all little girls, when they turn 4, they turn just a little bit black. You're not gonna be like all the way black. You'll be like brown, like Daddy's sweater.
Like brown?
Like an M&M. Yeah, like, you know, when you go to the store, you buy the M&Ms and they're all the different colors.
Oh yeah.
You're just gonna be like a brown M&M. You're not going to be like all the way like black, like the sky dark black, not like that. Just like chocolate. Do you want to be chocolate? That will be fun? No, but you're going to be all the way black. So that's...
No!
Yeah, you're going to be like midnight, like 8 ball.
Okay, so this was a video of a dad who thought that it would be funny to tell his 4-year-old daughter that she was going to turn black, just to see how she would react to it. And so I thought that this was a good way to start the presentation, because we don't really think about race in the way that I think about race. I don't think most people do. And so what I wanted to do was to show you, and you guys will see during the course of the presentation, that what I want to try to do is represent how we have been taught to see race. Why we've been taught to believe that race is something that's real, even though it really isn't race. And how, because we believe that it's real, even though it isn't biologically real, it's real to us in a particular way. So this little girl obviously was terrified that she was going to turn black, because her dad thought that, oh, this would be funny. And so they put the video out and they thought that it was really funny. I'm sure that once they looked at it again, they probably felt that they were kind of stupid for doing it, because who knows what impact that'll have on that little girl moving forward. I mean, maybe she'll say, oh, okay, it was just a joke and it was funny or whatever, but we don't really know. So, when we talk about race, what is it? What is race? We think we know what it is. We talk about it all the time. We hear people on television talking about it. We hear people in the movies. We're infested with talk about race in this country and have been for a very long time. But what is it? And I did a lot of deep thinking about it, and I was trying to figure it out, and I like this idea, even though they weren't talking about race, with this quote: a riddle wrapped inside a mystery, inside an enigma. Because we really don't know what it is. We think we do. I could ask 100 people and I'd probably get 100 different answers, because we really don't know what race is. So my question to you, and hopefully some of you will volunteer, but what is race? How would you describe it? If a person came from another planet and said, I want to ask you one question, what is race? What would you say? What would you say? Anyway, and please don't feel pressured to answer, but if you'd like to answer, anyone want to give it a try? Yes, thank you.
This is what I think it is, and I could be totally wrong, okay, so don't think jump on me. And I'm not racist as far as I'm not here to argue or anything like that. But I think, in my opinion, that human beings are products of their physical environment. Wherever your people, your original tribe, live, airflow, sunlight, gravity pull determines your height, skin color, eye shape. I think that 10,000 years of no contact, these people were isolated, they grew to adapt to their environment, and that is why they look different, they have a different culture. It's all adaptation to their environment. And then we all started to meet.
Okay.
And that otherness is what we're afraid of.
Okay, that's great. That's great. Anyone else want to share? There are no right and wrong answers. It's basically how we feel, and I'm sure that all of you are probably thinking, maybe you don't want to say it, you guys are probably thinking of what your idea of race is. And I always like to let people know that when you look at it, when you study the idea of race, depending on who you read, which study you look at, which particular scholar that has written about it, everybody goes about it in a different way. Everybody kind of describes it in a different way. A lot of the things that you said are part of the discussion. But I want you guys to understand this by the end of the presentation, that regardless of how we see it, there's something very clear about what it really is in our minds that we don't tend to think about. And I'm hoping by the end of this presentation that you guys will see it in that particular way, okay? Thank you for sharing, I appreciate that. So, let's look at some dictionary definitions. A group of persons related by common descent or heredity, that's related to what you said. Any people united by common history, language, cultural traits, etc. That's another one that's interesting. Let me go back. That one went too fast. Okay, here we go. All right. And the last one is talking about some of the things that you mentioned. So when we look at, and I don't know why that one just wants to go away, but basically that one talked about people that come together and have a shared history, and they call themselves part of the same, like you said, tribe. That's another dictionary definition of race. So that's typically how we look at it. The idea of race as a concept has changed over the course of time. Years and years ago, when people talked about race, they basically were talking about what we would consider to be cultural groups. People would talk about the Spanish race, the Germanic race, the race of people from different places. So depending on what particular group that you belong to, they would consider that to be a racial group. However, nowadays, we define it completely differently. And so let's look at the early ideas that flew from Europeans, because they really created the concept that we see as race today. It came out of the minds of different Europeans. And it was very interesting for me to go and look for evidence of this idea of race in the history of people who weren't from Europe. I looked very closely at people from different Asian countries, different places in terms of the indigenous population of the Americas, different peoples in Africa, and I couldn't find this idea of race in terms of people looking at people in a biological way. They typically looked at people simply by the group that they belong to. And people could look the same but belong to a completely different group, and they recognized that these were different groups. Whereas this idea of race that developed basically said that we're going to group people together based on certain characteristics that have nothing to do with their culture. And you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. There's a French guy by the name of Bernier, and he wrote back in 1684, he wrote this book, 600 and some odd pages, and one of the things that he looked at defining races of men who inhabit the planet Earth. And he said that, we can look at physical characteristics such as skin color and develop different racial groups based on this. This was the first time it was articulated in writing that we can use skin color to articulate races of men. It had never been done before. No one had articulated that particular idea in that way prior to Mr. Bernier. Another man, I don't know if you guys, anybody familiar with Linnaeus? If you guys ever took a biology course and they talked about all the different varieties of plants, all the different varieties of this, that, and the other, you can thank this guy. He created that system. He was a botanist. He created the system of naming basically everything on the planet Earth. And of course, he wrote this book where he decided to divide humans into 4 separate groups. Okay? So he divided humans into these particular categories. He said that there was a group that he referred to as Americanus. These were people that we would typically refer to as the native or indigenous people of America. And he did something that no one else had ever done, and something that I think is really, really critical. He not only talked about, like Bernier, talked about the differences in terms of how they looked, but he said that there were certain characteristics that those people had as individuals because they were part of that group. They had certain characteristics in terms of how you could see them as a person. So, for instance, he talked about their color. He said that they were choleric, that they were very sickly people. He said that they stood erect, their hair was black, it was straight, it was thick, they had wide nostrils, a skinny, scanty beard. He said they were very obstinate, stubborn people. All of them, not just some of them, all of them. He said that they were merry, they liked to party, they had a good time, they were free, they were regulated by the customs of their society. Now he said that these characteristics existed simply because they were a member of this particular racial group which he created. He created the group. He said that these people belong to this particular group. So imagine this. We go from talking about races of people where we define them simply by how they look to now giving certain characteristics to all the people in that group. Simply because we can identify them as part of that group by how they look, but now we can give them characteristics and define how we should see them, how they act. That was very, very important step in this process. Asiaticus, sallow, melancholy, stiff, black hair, dark eyes, severe, haughty, avaricious, ruled by opinions. He felt that Asian people were very arrogant. Very arrogant. All of them. Okay? Imagine that. Africanus, people from Africa. Black, phlegmatic, relaxed, black hair, frizzled. Skin was very silky, he said. Flat noses, lips were tumid. Women without shame. The women had no shame. None of them had any shame. They lactate profusely. They were very crafty, indolent, negligent, and they were governed by caprice. He basically said that the African people had no morals. They had no morals. All of them had no morals. And he could differentiate them simply by how they looked. So imagine you take a group of people, you lump them together, and you say that all of them have these characteristics. Okay? And finally, the group that he belonged to, he said that they were white, sanguine, muscular, long hair, flowing hair, blue eyes, all of them. I don't know how I got that. Gentle, acute, inventive, governed by laws. Governed by laws. So, not only are we giving people a name, placing them into categories, we're now giving each of those groups characteristics that now supposedly apply to all of them. So what are we doing? We're giving value to those particular groups that we want to give value to, and we're taking value away from some of those others. So we'll see how this played out. So this was a very important idea that Mr. Linnaeus came up with. He considered physical attributes as well as behavior to be born racial traits. You were born this way. You couldn't change. You were this way because you were born into these particular 4 racial groups. This was way different than anything anyone else had ever said about this idea of race before. No one had ever given value or characteristics and said that these characteristics apply to people from these groups. And really the only way you can define these groups at this particular time, there's 2 ways. You can define them by where they lived and how they looked. Nothing else. There was no biology behind it. There was no science behind it. There were no studies that had been done. No one had really looked into this in a physical way, in a medical way. He just decided that based on his travels around the world, that these were things that he noticed about these particular groups, and he lumped them into 4 racial groups. Everybody on the planet belonged to one of these 4. Mr. Blumenbach took it a step further. He decided that he was going to divide the races into 5 separate races in 1779. So instead of 4, he said there are actually 5. And he was a little bit different. He felt that everybody was pretty much on a level playing field. He didn't feel that one group was superior to another group. So he didn't give them this value or take value away from them like Mr. Linnaeus had done. So he was a little bit different. So let's look at his 5 races. He came up with these names: the Caucasian or white race. Anybody know where the name Caucasian came from? He came up with the term.
The Caucasus Mountains? I mean, just
He had traveled to the nation that we now call Georgia, and it borders on the Caucasus Mountains. And he felt that these were the most beautiful, handsome people anywhere in the world that he had seen. And so he named this group of people the Caucasian race. That's where the term comes from. Mongolian or yellow race, Asians. Malayan or brown race. Ethiopian or black race. And the American or red race, the native people of America. And I can very clearly remember as a child going to school, and I don't know why this stuck in my brain, but it's stuck in my brain and it just won't go away. But I can remember reading in an encyclopedia. I used to read encyclopedias all the time. I was just such a nerdy little kid. Anybody's house I went over that had encyclopedias, I just picked them up and just read. I just always had a love of reading. And I can remember reading, and I can remember, and I don't remember what teacher it was, but I can remember very clearly a teacher giving us a lesson talking about the races of the world. And I can remember them describing the races as Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. Those terms are still stuck in my brain. They won't disappear. And I can still remember those when I was a little kid, way back in the early 70s. When I first moved to Milwaukee, those terms are still stuck in my mind. And I guess at the time I didn't really think about them. But I believe somewhere along the way, that experience and then reading about them, it triggered something in my mind. It triggered me to want to know more. And what's really interesting about it, my mother-in-law has a set of encyclopedias that she purchased 1970. She still has them. They're in pristine condition. And I go by her house, and one day I decided just to pick it up and just kind of look and see some of the things, and it was amazing to see those terms again. Caucasoid, Mongoloid, Negroid. And this was, 2 years ago when I did that. So, this is a quote from a person that you're all familiar with. You probably don't have a clue who he is, but just read this quote. So this is a person that felt that the concept of race or races served them well as a politician. Anybody have a clue who said that? A person who really used the idea of race to do some things that we look back on now and we say some of the most horrific things ever done. Adolf Hitler said this. Now we all know that part of what came out of the Nazi regime was this idea of a master race, the Aryans, this master race, and that every other race was this inferior group. But he knew that it was all a lie. He knew that it wasn't real. He says it here. It wasn't real. But it served my purposes to use this concept. I was able to get things done by using this concept. I want you guys to watch this film. It's actually, let me show you. There's a group that put together a series of documentaries, and I'm going to show you guys this. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And it's available from California Newsreel. I purchased it about a year ago. But they go into great detail about the history of how the idea of race came about. They go into whether or not it's a biological concept or not. And so part of what I want you guys to do is to watch this portion of it. It's about 4 hours, so you're not gonna watch that much of it. But I want you guys to see at least a portion of it that I kind of edited together. So that you can kind of get an idea of how this idea came about.
There is no question that individual human beings are different, one from the other. Our eyes confirm this day in and day out. Skin color, body shape, hair form, eye shape. For several hundred years, we have used these visual differences to classify people into 4 or 5 groups we call races.
We have a notion of race as being divisions among people that are deep, that are essential, that are somehow biological or even genetic, and that are unchanging, that these are clear-cut, distinct categories of people.
And the beauty of the race business is that you can identify people by just looking at them. You don't even have to look at their genes because one manifestation of their genes is there, namely skin color or eye shape or hair shape. And then that's the key to everything.
The idea of race assumes that simple external differences, rooted in biology, are linked to other, more complex internal differences, like athletic ability, musical aptitude, intelligence. This belief is based on the idea that race is biologically real.
All of our genetics now is telling us that that's not the case. We can't find any genetic markers that are in everybody of a particular race and in nobody of some other race. We can't find any genetic markers that define race.
And actually, what we're going to generate are billions of copies of a little section of your genetic code. And we're going to look
These students are gathering for a DNA workshop led by Cold Spring Harbor Labs teacher Scott Bronson.
and pipe it up 30 microliters, filled into
Marcus, Gorgeous,
transfer it to these tiny
Jackie,
green tubes.
Noah,
Little green tubes.
Hannah, Jamil, and their fellow students are about to explore the biology of human variation.
But there's another type of DNA. Does anybody know what that type of DNA is? Yeah. Mitochondrial DNA. Very good.
They will compare their skin colors.
They're like not human colors.
They will type their blood. And they will swab cells from inside their mouths to extract a small portion of their own DNA. Once the sample is ready, they will compare some of their genetic similarities and differences.
We're going to look at a very tiny section of this ring. We're just going to look at
The students begin the workshop with the same assumptions most of us have.
As you begin to look at the data, you might want to keep in your mind who you think you might be most similar to and who you think you might be most different to.
I think I probably have the most similarities with Mr. Bronson or with Carol because we were white males, both Carol and I, and both Scott Bronson and I.
I think I'd have the most differences with Carol and the most similarities with Gorgeous.
She's African American, I'm African American. I mean, like, black.
I think maybe me and Natalia are most alike. She's Latin American and I'm Latin American. I figured that there would be tons of differences, especially with people who looked so different. Person type 2.
To understand why the idea of race is a biological myth requires a major paradigm shift, an absolute paradigm shift, a shift in perspective. And for me, it's like seeing, what it must have been like to understand that the world isn't flat. And perhaps I can invite you to a mountaintop, and you can look out the window and at the horizon and see, what I thought was flat, I can see a curve in now. That the world is much more complicated. In fact, that race is not based on biology, but race is rather an idea that we ascribe to biology.
The idea of race as biology is ferociously persistent on America's playing fields. Gorgeous Harper and her teammates are competing at the Adidas Nationals.
I love to run track. I've been running track since I was 8 years old. The people I train with, they all want to be the best, and you got to put in the hard work.
This is the top event for elite high school track and field stars. And while racial differences are not necessarily discussed openly, they are often part of the careful calculation of competitive edge.
Well, I've heard some rumors I've heard are just like blacks have an extra muscle in their leg, but I don't think anything's true.
I assume that a white girl can't beat me in the 200. In my mind, I don't think she can beat me, but I won't sleep on her.
I don't want to get too controversial here since I really don't know exactly, but I'd say that there's maybe a little bit that, not to use as an excuse as why they beat me sometimes, but maybe considering when you look at the Olympics, who tends to dominate the 100, the 200, and the quarter for the most part. I just have to say the way it all falls out tends to point to what your race is.
I'm really saying that different populations, whether it's West African descended blacks, and that's what African Americans trace their ancestry to West Africa, or East Africans, or whites or Asians, they all have different body types and different physiological structures that allow them to have advantages in one sport or another. There are, as a genetic basis for these kinds of differences, through culture, environment, training, athletes can't dramatically change the limits of what they can be.
I would like to say to John, there is no scientific definition that holds up about race. Race has changed its definition in this country to the benefit of those who wanted to define it differently. And there is no scientific place to start from, so you have no basis for your work.
We can see differences among populations, but can populations be bundled into what we call races? How many races would there be? 5? 55? Who decides? And how different would they really be from one another?
The measured amount of genetic variation in the human population is extremely small. And it's something that people need to wrap themselves around, that genetically we really aren't very different.
Of the small amount of variation between us, what, if any, is mapped along what we think of as racial lines? Because we live in a racialized society, this is not an academic question. We have a long history of searching for racial differences and attributing performance and behavior to them. For 200 years, scientists poked and prodded, measured and mapped the human body, searching for a biological basis to race. Some measured facial angle to illustrate the proximity of races to the primitive. Others calibrated skull size to identify those with superior or inferior intelligence. Measures of eye shape, hair form, even brain color were scrutinized in the hunt for the fundamental sources of racial difference.
If we just take African Americans as an example, there's not a single body part that hasn't been subjected to this kind of analysis. You'll find articles in the medical literature about the Negro ear, and the Negro nose, and the Negro leg, and the Negro heart, and the Negro eye, and the Negro foot, and it's every single body part. And they're constantly looking for some organ that might be so fundamentally different in size and character that you can say this is something specific to the Negro versus whites and other groups. Scientists are part of their social context. Their ideas about what race is are not simply scientific ones, are not simply driven by the data that they are working with. It's also informed by the societies in which they live.
At the turn of the 20th century, American society was riding a wave of confidence as an emerging industrial power. And the face of its power and prosperity was white. African Americans lived under the yoke of Jim Crow segregation. Most surviving Native Americans had been banished to reservations, and new immigrants crowded into urban ghettos. Disease was rampant. Death rates soared. Infant mortality was high. To many, this reflected a preordained natural order.
Those that looked wanted to confirm what they saw, which is to say that the proper place of, say, the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be. Then it's natural for them to be at the bottom of our social hierarchy.
The biology becomes an excuse for social differences. The social differences become naturalized in biology. It's not that our institutions cause differences in infant mortality, it's that there really are biological differences between the races.
For Prudential life insurance statistician Frederick Hoffman, those differences could lead to only one fate for African Americans. In Vital Capacity, he wrote, "The tendency of the Negro race has been downward. This tendency must lead to a still greater mortality, and in the end, cause the extinction of the race." Hoffman's Race Traits and Tendencies of the American Negro was published in 1896. The same year, the Supreme Court legalized segregation. It was one of the most influential publications of its day.
What's interesting is that it resonated in the minds of so many other social observers of the time, the extinction thesis. It fit into their notions of how races become ascendant in the world. They looked at other groups of people in various stages beneath them as approaching the completely civilized stage.
Hoffman presented his statistical data as unimpeachable science. He compared rates of death and disease between African Americans and whites, and, not surprisingly, found enormous disparities. But his data analysis was flawed. He ignored the insidious effects of poverty and social neglect on health. In contrast to today's belief in black physical superiority, Hoffman concluded that African Americans were innately infirm. As such, attempts to improve their housing, health, and education would be futile. Their extinction was inevitable, encoded in their blood. By the 1920s, a single drop of blood reflecting African ancestry could identify any individual as black and inferior in every way. In the not-so-distant past, many of these students would have been considered contaminants, were they to have bred into the superior white race. 28 states passed laws forbidding intermarriage to safeguard white racial purity.
The Nazi propaganda machine pointed out that their eugenic policies were entirely consistent and in fact derived from ideas of American race scientists.
At the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Hitler's Aryan race was to have confirmed its place at the top of nature's hierarchy. But the star of the games would shatter those expectations.
And the games are on. Here in the semi-final heat of the 100-meter dash, Louis Tone's camera catches the blinding speed of Jesse Owens, cracking the world record in the incredible time of 10 2/10 seconds.
As a child, Jesse Owens had been chronically ill, destined, it seemed, to fulfill Hoffman's extinction thesis, until a teacher intervened. When he first asked me to go out for the track team in 5th grade, Owens wrote in his autobiography, "It wasn't because he saw any potential champion in me. It was because he saw a potential corpse."
Owens is ahead! Sternberg and Boltzmann are fighting! Osendorf challenges Wyckoff! Owens wins in 10.3! Second, Metcalf America.
How could a society steeped in the science of racial inferiority reconcile itself to Owens' 4 gold medals? By conceding innate athletic superiority to African Americans while denying them so-called civilized capacities. In the words of American team coach Dean Cromwell, the Negro athlete excelled because he was closer to the primitive. It was not so long ago that his ability to sprint and jump was a life and death matter to him in the jungle.
Star of the squad goes the laurel of the champion.
The competition was grand, and we're very glad to come out on top. Thank you very kindly.
A flurry of debate between racial scientists and those contesting their assumptions greeted Owens' accomplishments.
With the rise of the great Negro athletes in the 1930s, it became this question that there must be a reason that they're great, and that reason must reside in biology rather than in culture or history or circumstance. And Jesse Owens was picked apart.
When the African-American anthropologist and physician Montague Cobb is trying to explain why Jesse Owens was such an outstanding track star, he does so by talking about his body. He talks about his feet, he talks about his legs, his calves, his chest capacity. And he comes to the conclusion, of course, that, you can't say that Negroes have some special characteristics that make them more fit as runners.
Among the few who challenge racial science, Cobb wrote, "There is not one single physical feature, including skin color, which all our Negro champions have in common, which would identify them as Negro." But what marker would identify them as Negro in the first place.
Think about race and its universality. Where is your measurement device? There is no way to measure race. We sometimes do it by skin color. Other people may do it by hair texture. Other people may have the dividing lines different in terms of skin color. What is black in the United States is not what's black in Brazil or what's black in South Africa.
And to atone for previous failures at the plate with that one.
My favorite trivia question in baseball is which Italian-American player for the Brooklyn Dodgers once hit 40 home runs in a season. No one ever gets it right, because the answer is Roy Campanella, who is as Italian as he was black. He had an Italian father and a black mother. He's always classified as black. You see, American racial classification is totally cultural. Who's Tiger Woods? Who's Colin Powell? Colin Powell's as Irish as he is African. Being black has been defined as just looking dark enough that anyone can see you are.
When I was a child, one of the things my father bought me was a set of Time Life books on science. And a book on evolution had in it a skin color scale that went from 1 to 36. And I would spend hours putting my arm against the scale in the book, the picture in the book, trying to figure out what number my color was. And I couldn't quite find myself on the scale.
You can be either 19 or 20. Who would be this color? I'm not 13.
I wonder if it matters how tan you are.
Yeah.
14.
Not 14. You're too pink.
I'd say that John and Noah, both white by appearance, and Jackie and I both fit under the Asian classification. But I guess the thing that surprised me was with the skin color test, what should you technically call the entire group?
I would never know that all our skin colors are so similar. Exactly, like we match.
Should you call them all white, or should you call them 11 to 15?
Wow, maybe lighter than those.
I'm white. Would I trade my skin color?
No. Okay, back.
I probably wouldn't trade my skin color. It's something that I've taken for granted. It's also a privilege, I guess. I think 13 is closer.
13 is closer.
Wow. We're like all 13.
I know.
There's no profit in denying it that there is a certain advantage to being white.
Now the Stars fight a pass through the Celtic defense.
In the urban environment of the 1930s, Jewish teams dominated American basketball.
But Castleman shoots from outside. It's good.
Sons of immigrants, theirs were the hoop dreams of the day.
And they rush it up the floor, and the Stars win.
And it was said that the reason that they were so good at basketball was because the artful dodger characteristic of the Jewish culture made them good at this sport. There are strong cultural aspects of what sports individuals choose to play. It has to do with the interaction of individual genetic background, of opportunity and training. History shows us that as opportunities change in society, different groups get drawn into sporting arenas.
By 1992, America's Olympic Dream Team was almost completely African American. 10 years later, 20% of NBA starters would be foreign-born. The top NBA draft pick, Chinese.
Racist biology simply doesn't work. But what is important is that race is a very salient social and historical concept, a social and historical idea. We live in racial smog.
Just because race isn't something biological, that doesn't mean it's not real. There are a lot of things in our society that are real and are not biological. Race, as we understand it as a social construct, has a lot to do with where somebody will live, what schools they will go to, what jobs they will get, whether or not they will have health insurance.
Black, white, and brown are merely skin colors. But we attach to them meanings and assumptions, even laws, that create enduring social inequality.
When I'm walking the streets alone at night, coming home from parties and stuff, I never get a sideways glance at people asking what I'm doing there. If a woman is stumbling with her shopping bags and I stop and say, "Would you like a hand?" I never get sort of a glance with two meanings. It's always, "Oh, nice white boy, you can help."
On my own campus, when I walk to classes, students often come up to me and ask me if I'm the football coach or the basketball coach. And I tell them, no, I'm a professor in the Department of Life Sciences.
It's easy to be white. It's very easy to be white. It's never been easy for Africans or African Americans here. Never. It's been a long, long time, since the abolition of slavery, African American slavery in this country. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Those ideas are still around.
No matter how they view themselves, the world sees Jackie, Gorgeous, and John as separate races. The social expectations that await them are in many ways dependent upon that racial assignment. Would our expectation about Gorgeous be that she is a champion athlete or valedictorian of her class? In fact, Gorgeous is both. But since the days of Jesse Owens, our society has more readily acknowledged and more avidly rewarded one of her talents over the other.
Race is a concept that was invented to categorize the perceived biological, social, and cultural differences between human groups.
And the beauty of that ideology is that it justifies what is the greatest social agony of American life. Namely, it justifies the inequalities that exist in a society, which is said to be based on equality.
Race is a human invention. We created it. We have used it in ways that have been, in many, many respects, quite negative and quite harmful. And we can think ourselves out of it. We made it, we can unmake it.
The racialized society we live in has been under construction for 3 centuries. How can we unmake race unless we first confront its enormity as a historical and social reality and its emptiness as biology?
One of the key points of that video as I watched it, and I've watched the entire series, but one of the key points is this idea of social expectations based on race. When we see people, we automatically identify people. I mean, it's instantaneous in our minds. It's not done consciously, it's done unconsciously. We refer to people, if we're having a conversation, let's just say we met someone today, and we're having a conversation about that person to someone later. We typically will identify that person. Oh, I met this black guy. Oh, I met this white lady who, oh, there was this really nice Asian guy. We do it automatically. As Americans, we're so caught up in it that we just do it. And we don't think about it when we do it, but it's part of our social expectation. We have to give people an idea of how to judge that person by describing them first. Think about that. If I was to tell you I met this really tall Asian guy, are you thinking of him being tall or are you thinking of being Asian? Which image pops in your mind first? It may be Asian, it may be tall. So we're mixed up. And we have been mixed up for a long time. So these are the official government definitions of racial groups. One of the keys to this is something that I think most people are completely unaware of. Hispanic is not a racial group. It's an ethnicity. You can be of any of these races and be Hispanic. You can be a black Hispanic if you're from the Dominican Republic. You can be an Asian Hispanic if you're from the Philippines. You can be a white Hispanic if you're from Spain. All of these different groups. And so there was all of this disparity in how races were defined. In 1977, under President Carter, he put together a group to come up with definitions that the government would use for different government programs. And so they came up with these definitions, and I actually read just yesterday that they're thinking of adding another ethnicity to the list as well on the next census. And that new ethnicity will actually be Mediterranean/North African. Or another term they're thinking of using, Middle Eastern/North African. So they're considering making that change to the next census that'll be done in 2020. So we have these definitions that the government has come up with, but they really don't mean a whole lot. They really don't mean a whole lot because we've learned these things as children. We've learned to identify people, or we think we can identify people. This shows you how difficult it is to identify a person's so-called racial group. Okay? This was part of the website that the people put together the video you just watched. This is activities on their website that you can go in and partake in yourself. And what they have here is a list of people, and you're supposed to be able to then classify those people into the different groups. American Indian, Asian, Hispanic, white, black, whatever. And so you click on the picture, you take a look at the person, and you see if you can somehow identify which racial group they belong to. And so I said, okay, let me give it a try. But I said, nah, I'm not gonna even be serious. I'm just gonna guess. I'm just gonna guess. Because I started looking at the pictures, I'm like, this is really, really hard. So I just started guessing. And so as I went through the pictures, I said, well, maybe this person was like this, and that one was like that. I was like, man, so I kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for a good 5 minutes. But eventually I came up with some answers, and I said, it doesn't really matter. I'm just guessing. But I want to kind of see how close I was to being accurate. And so we think as Americans that we can automatically identify a person just by looking at them. Oh, I know what race they belong to. Or sometimes we may question, well, are they this or are they that? Maybe they're a mixture of this or maybe and we'll oftentimes ask people, what are you? Imagine that. What are you? And I have friends that people have come up and asked them those questions. So this was a list I made. This is how I categorize the people. And I said, okay, it might be right, it might be wrong. It doesn't really matter because I can go back and change it later and re-guess. But I looked at mine and I said, okay, I think these people belong in this particular group, these people belong in that group, and then I looked at the real answers. So, 1960, census enumerators classified people the way we typically do, by looking at them. But the government said, we're going to stop doing that. We're going to start allowing people to self-identify, to tell us what groups they belong to when we do the census. So, these were my guesses on the top, and any of these that were kind of like this, I was wrong. So, out of all of those, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 correct. All the rest I got wrong. I thought I was, even though I knew I was just guessing, I thought I'd do a little bit better than that. So, these people that are on here, they talked to them. They took their pictures and they talked to them and they said, well, how do you self-identify? What group do you belong to? And they said, do you ever have comments that people make to you related to race? And how do you respond when people ask you what race you belong to? So these were the things that these people said. This particular individual's American Indian. He identified as Native American. He said people often assume that I'm spiritual. Native Americans. This woman self-identified as Native American. She's classified as Native American. She says people trying to guess my race will say anything from Japanese to Hispanic to Native American to black. That's a pretty wide range, right? This next person, look at her. She identifies as Sioux, American Indian. She says people assume I'm good with directions and good with animals. I must ride horses or something. Right? So these are the assumptions that we make. These social expectations we have. This young woman, American Indian, and she identifies as Native American. Next person, Asian. She identifies as Asian American. She says, I don't think of myself in racial terms, I'm just American. Which a lot of people say. I'm just human, or I'm just American, or whatever. This next person, Asian, Filipino American, he identifies himself as, he says, people assume I'm Latino or part white. They think I'm a good dancer or say disparaging things in front of me about other ethnic groups, which happens a lot. People assume that you belong to a particular group, and then they'll start saying things that they think are okay because, well, all of us feel that way about them, so I can say, but of course it doesn't always work. This person, she says people assume that she was born in this exotic place. She was born in North Dakota. What's exotic about North Dakota? People ask this guy what race he is, and he doesn't like it. He says, why do you want to know? And some people will say that. This woman identifies as black. She says, even after I say I'm black, people insist I'm something else. Brazilian, Spanish, Italian, etc. They refuse to accept what she says she is. They won't accept it. This person classifies as Jamaican or mixed. People will guess that I'm Indian, Hispanic, Greek, Middle Eastern, or mixed, depending on how I wear my hair. Imagine that. Changes race with a different hairstyle. Black, self-identifies as black. People guess that I'm white. I know I'm a black woman, but I think of myself more in terms of character traits than race. Next person on the list, self-identified as biracial, considered as black by the U.S. government. She says, assuming that I'm white, people have said things about African Americans in front of me. Happens all the time. Next person on our list, Hispanic, self-identifies as white/Hispanic, and he says, I never concern myself with race. I've heard people say that all the time. Race doesn't matter. It's, colorblind society. Race really doesn't matter. This woman, Hispanic, Latino, self-identifies as Puerto Rican Latina. I'm a Latina when I'm with Anglos and Anglo when I'm with Latinos. So she's going back and forth. So she's switching it up. It's amazing that you can do that. So that's how she responds. This next individual, Hispanic, Latino. People think I'm East Asian or Native American, never Latino. Or they think, you can't be Chicano, you're too tall. Chicanos are all short? Come on, we know there's no tall Chicanos. This guy, Hispanic. I've had people assume I'm poor, lazy, stupid, and likely to steal. But now with the Latin explosion in pop culture, stereotypes are changing from negative to positive. Next person on our list is classified as white by the government. Bavarian German, his ancestry. People think I'm Mexican because I tan easily and have a mustache. Imagine that, being a white guy, people are constantly thinking you're Mexican. I don't think that guy's too happy about that. White woman. In France, people guess that I'm North African. Everywhere else I'm seen as French or Caucasian. Another person who people are mixed up about on a regular basis. This individual, white, he identifies his race as human, which some people do. A lot of people guess that I'm Mexican or Italian. I think of myself in cultural terms, not racial terms. And this woman, white, Southern European is how she describes herself. She's from Azorean Portuguese and Northern Italian descent. Although I blend in as a white person now, that wasn't the case growing up in rural Northern California years ago. The Azorean Portuguese were thought of in a very negative way. So even though we think we can tell just by looking, we can't. We misidentify people all the time. So appearance doesn't always tell you about someone's ancestry or self-identity. It's hard to make accurate predictions based on appearance alone. Classifying people isn't necessarily good or bad. It depends on the purpose. Race can't tell you where somebody is from, what they're naturally good at, or how they might behave, but it can tell you who is being discriminated against and who lacks certain opportunities. So there is a value to using the idea of race. However, as you guys saw, it's very, very difficult to identify people. We think that we can just do it automatically. One of the tests that we oftentimes use is the idea of skin color. And as you guys remember in the film, the students compared their skin colors and saw that they were very similar in many cases. So these people, you had an American Indian, 2 blacks, 1 Latino, and 2 whites who had light skin, according to that scale that they used. Medium light skin, an American Indian, 2 Latinos, and 1 white had medium light skin. Medium skin, 2 American Indians, 3 Asians, 1 black, 1 Latino, 1 white, all had medium skin. And then when it came to dark skin, there was 1 Asian and 1 black that had dark skin, using that scale that the students used in the film. So once again, skin color doesn't work either. We think that it does. We think that we can just assume, but I learned a long time ago, never assume, because it makes it, you know what? You guys have all heard that, but I heard a different version. When you assume, you make an ASS of you in front of me. So that's the way I like to use that term. So, never make assumptions about a person's race, because in many cases you're going to be wrong. And it just shows you how biologically it's not an accurate indicator. It's not real. So let's look at some of the socially constructed benefits of race. The idea of race was not created and used historically just to describe people. It was used to create a system that gave benefits to people of particular racial groups. And I'll show you guys how this goes back many, many years ago. Nearly all major social institutions in America since its founding have been under the control of white people. If we look at the Fortune 500 companies today, 97% of them have a white male as a CEO. There are a handful that have women. There's maybe 2 or 3 that have African American, but a majority of them are controlled by whites. These institutions have created advantages to whites while denying opportunities to non-whites. We see it all the time. The Donald Sterling case. This man became a billionaire by purchasing real estate. And he used the power as his landlord to control who could and could not live in those apartments that he was renting out. In addition to that, he thought that he could just openly say that he didn't want this girlfriend of his to take pictures with people of a particular race. He didn't want her to bring those people to his games. So he was creating a situation, because he had the power to create a situation that denied certain groups of people power to do or to not do. And that's the power of race. The power of race comes from a group of people having the power to dictate the outcomes for people from other groups or themselves. The idea of race has been at the center of the creation of wealth and opportunity for whites while denying this to other groups. If we go back to the days of enslavement of Africans, millions of Africans were brought over, enslaved, and they were forced to work for free for 200 some odd years. If we look at the Native Americans who were here, the indigenous people of America, they were here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Europeans decided they wanted their land, they took their land. It's not as if they gave them something in return for it. Oh, here, we'll pay you for this land. Manhattan Island, this big island in New York, was purchased for basically what would be the equivalent of about $5 today. But, I mean, if you're on the side of people who have no power, you'll have to accept that. What, are you going to fight back? Wall Street in New York City. All of us know what Wall Street is today. Back in the day, Wall Street was a place where they had a multitude of places where you could go and buy slaves on any given day. You go down to Wall Street and they had a market here, a market there, a market 3 blocks down. So the wealth of America that was generated began very early on by denying opportunities to certain groups. So let's take a look at how this racial advantage was created in law from the first years of English colonization. It's important that we recognize it was done with the law. The laws of America created this situation. Laws are not created by themselves. People create laws. People write laws. We elect politicians to create laws. And these laws are written to specifically give advantages to whites in America. And many of our heroes from American history have talked about this in great detail. They basically said that this is a white country founded by white people to the benefit of white people. They were not, tongue-tied about it. They were not worried about political correctness. They said it very openly and honestly. That's how they felt, and that's what they created, a nation to advantage whites. So let's look at a timeline of how race has impacted life in America. 1662, Virginia enacts a law of hereditary slavery, meaning that a child born to a enslaved mother inherits her slave status. This is the first American law, and it wasn't even America yet. This is the first law in the colonies which created a situation that directly affected blacks. If your mother was a slave, you're going to be born into slavery. Okay? 1664, Maryland is the first colony to take legal action against marriages between white women and black men. Basically said you couldn't marry whomever you chose to marry. There were certain people you could marry, certain people you could not marry. The state of Maryland mandates lifelong servitude for all black slaves. New York, New Jersey, Carolinas, Virginia all passed similar laws shortly thereafter. People oftentimes think of slavery as a southern institution. Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Texas. All of the original 13 colonies had slave laws on the books, had slaves. They eventually got rid of those laws because they didn't have cash crops in the north. It wasn't as profitable. 1670, the state of Virginia prohibits free blacks and Indians from keeping a Christian, also known as white person, servant. We don't know, but back in these days, the colonial days, whites did not refer to themselves as white. If you look at all of the writings from the colonies up until really about 1680 or so, the colonists described themselves as Christian. They never used the terms white. They called themselves Christians. And the laws that they wrote, anything that they wrote talking about what was going on in their particular corner of the world, they referred to themselves as Christians, which was a code word for white. 1674, New York declares that blacks who convert to Christianity after enslavement will not be freed. That was kind of a backdoor way of getting out of slavery. If you converted to Christianity, Christian law said you could not enslave other Christians. So blacks said, well, shoot, let me convert. Hey, where do I go to convert to Christianity? Because I want to be free. And of course, that loophole was closed very quickly. 1680, the state of Virginia forbids blacks from bearing arms, prohibits blacks from congregating in large numbers, and mandates harsh punishment for slaves who assault whites or attempt to escape. Once again, impacted specific groups of people. 1682, Virginia declares that all imported blacks are slaves for life. 1691, Virginia passes the first Anti-Miscegenation Law forbidding marriages between whites and blacks or whites and Native Americans. So once again, groups are separated and told what they can and can't do based on this idea of race. 1691, Virginia prohibits the manumission of slaves within its borders, basically saying that you can't free any slaves, and if you do free them, they have to leave the state. 1702, New York passed an act for regulating slaves. Among the prohibitions of this act are meetings of more than 3 slaves, trading by slaves, and testimony by slaves in court. So this is basically saying that blacks cannot testify in court if they're enslaved, taking a fundamental right that whites just assumed they had and never had to question, but blacks had that right taken away from them, simply because they were black. 1703, Massachusetts requires every master who liberates a slave to pay a bond of 50 pounds or more in case the freedman becomes a public charge. So if you give someone freedom, you have to pay to make sure that they don't become destitute and become something that the state has to take care of. 1703, Connecticut assigns the punishment of whipping to any slaves who disturb the peace or assault whites. Rhode Island makes it illegal for blacks and Indians to walk at night without passes. So now you have this idea that blacks and Native Americans have to have a pass in order to walk. You can't even walk at night without a pass. Does that sound familiar to the pass laws in South Africa? The pass laws? Same thing. Where do you think they got the idea from? Americans have had influence on people far and wide. That's where the idea of the pass laws in South Africa came from. Virginia slave codes codifies slave status. It defines all slaves as real estate. So now, blacks are real estate. Acquits masters who kill slaves during punishment. So now you can kill one of your slaves and you don't have to worry about punishment. Forbids slaves and free colored persons from physically assaulting white people. Denies slaves the right to bear arms or move abroad without written permission. Once again, you have to get permission from a white in order to do something that all of us should be able to do. New York declares that punishment by execution will be applied to certain runaway slaves. So just running away, you can be executed for running away. 1705, Massachusetts makes marriage and sexual relations between blacks and whites illegal. 1706, New York declares blacks, Indians, and slaves who kill white people to be subject to the... Imagine that! It makes it illegal to murder other blacks, Indians, and slaves. New York forbids free blacks, Indians, and mulatto slaves from owning real estate and holding property. The disadvantage economically begins at this time. Not only are you working for free, but even if you're a person who wants to make a little money, you can't do it legally. Charleston, South Carolina, slaves are forbidden from hiring themselves out. Because you may be a carpenter, you hire yourself out, do some work, make a little extra money, put it away to maybe pay for your freedom later. Can't do it anymore. 1715, Maryland declares all slaves entering the province and their descendants to be slaves for life. 1723, Virginia outlaws manumission. You can't free slaves any longer. 1724, Fritz, Louisiana prohibits slaves from marrying without the permission of their owners. So now you can't even get married without a white person saying, okay, you can get married. You see the benefits. I could go on, but I hope you get the point. Early on in the history of what eventually became the United States, laws were created to give advantages to whites and disadvantages to people who weren't white. Disadvantages to blacks, disadvantages to people who were mixed race, disadvantages to Native Americans, all to the benefit of whites. These laws were written by whites to benefit themselves. It created a situation where you automatically put things in place that made sure that these other groups could not compete with you economically. They could not compete with you in a social way. So you create a situation
Sorry I'm being so
like
negative.
this.
I'm a bummer. I don't know. I shouldn't be. I'm a very, lucky guy. I got a lot going for me. I'm healthy. I'm relatively young. I'm white, which that is a huge leg up. Are you kidding me? Oh, God, I love being white. I really do. Seriously, if you're not white, you're missing out because this is thoroughly good. But let me be clear, by the way. I'm not saying that white people are better. I'm saying that being white is clearly better. Who could even argue? If it was an option, I would re-up every year. Oh yeah, I'll take white again. Absolutely. I've been enjoying that. I'm going to stick with white. Thank you. Here's how great it is to be white. I could get in a time machine and go to any time, and it would be an awesome when I get there. Exclusively a white privilege.
Louis C.K. Made a very relevant point in a comical way, and he's being perfectly honest. He's basically telling you that being white obviously has its advantages, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find people who are honest that would disagree with him. I know, and I've met people that would disagree with him. I mean, they would adamantly disagree with him. But if they were to be honest, they would agree with him. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of effort for you to recognize that. If you just take a look at how America has played out in terms of its history, just like you said, if you created a time machine, I got in a time machine, you think I'm going to go back to 1840? Really? You think I'm going to go back to 1955? You think I'm going to go back to 1687? No. I would even be afraid of going into the future because who knows what the heck is going to be going on 50 years from now. If somebody gave me a time machine, I'm going to put in today's date. I'm not going anywhere because it may or may not work out. If I get in there and I put 2014 and I type in 1914 by mistake, I'm going to be in a lot of trouble when I get to 1914. That's just the reality of life in America. So these people were witnesses to white socially created racial advantage. 4-year-old girl not wanting to be black, 50-year-old man who loves the advantage of being white. I think when we look at how race is played out in terms of this racial advantage that whites have, which many people refer to as white privilege, there's been a lot of discourse about white privilege over the last 20 some odd years. A lot of scholarly research has been done on it. And I think for the first time in American history, people have kind of looked at that advantage that whites have and said, you know, we can quantify this advantage. We can actually look at numbers and say that if you're born to a particular group, we can look at outcomes for you. I'll give you an example. When we look at the prison population in the United States of America, in 1970 we had about 300,000 people in our prison system. 2 years ago we had 2.3 million people in our prison system. It's gone down a little bit. It's gone down about maybe 40,000, primarily because states are running out of money to run prisons, so they're closing prisons and sending people home. But we have the largest prison population on the planet Earth. People in the United States, we make up 5% of the world's population, but we make up 25% of the world's prison population. And I just looked up the numbers recently, the most recent data that's available, which is 2012 numbers, the end of 2012. Blacks make up about 42% of the prison and jail population in the United States. 42% of the prison and jail population. But it's a little bit deeper than that though. Blacks typically make up somewhere between 12 and 13% of the US population overall, 42% of the prison and jail population. But I wanted to look into it a little bit deeper because not everybody is in jail. They don't have any 3-year-old black boys in jail. 14-year-old black boys are not likely to be in prison. So when you look at the majority of people who are in prison are between the ages of 18 and 55. That makes up 97% of the prison population are 18 to 55. So if you look at black males, 18 to 55, the percentage of America's population we make up is 3%. So 18 to 55-year-old black males make up 3 out of every 100 person in America. Yet that same demographic makes up 42% of America's prison and jail population. That's not an accident. If you look at the unemployment rate, and you go back to the first time they started looking at unemployment rates and comparing it by different racial groups, you'll find that it's pretty much a straight line that shows that black unemployment in this country has almost always, over the last 80 years that they've been measuring it, has almost always been about double the unemployment rate for whites. It's not an accident. It's been very, very consistent. So these outcomes you can see that are a part of the system that's been created. Race is not biological, but it's very real. It's very real. It has an impact on people's lives on a daily basis. The social construction of race coincided with the genocide and theft of indigenous people's land, as well as the enslavement of millions of African people. They go hand in hand. The idea of race came about at the same time these things were occurring. Social construction of race allowed for justification of advantages to whites. It allowed whites to say, well, we're justified in enslaving Africans because they are inferior to us. We are justified in this genocide that we've committed against Native Americans because they're a bunch of savages. They're not using the land for anything. They're wasting the land. This is what people said. We're going to move them off the land because they're not doing anything on it. They're just living on it. They're not growing any food. They're not doing any, they're just living on it. We need to use this land and make it productive. And it was justified. Killing these people, forcing them to leave. The social construction of race created advantages for whites that have been maintained and passed down generationally, from generation to generation. And I've heard many people say to me over the years, my family never owned any slaves. My family came here many years after slavery ended. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because when those immigrants came over in the 1880s, the 1890s, the 1910s, the 1920s, who were white, who were accepted as white, some of them weren't. Those Europeans who came over from Southern and Eastern Europe were not even considered to be good enough white people to stay. And in 1924, they passed the strictest immigration law in American history that denied those people admittance into the United States. Said, we have enough of them here, we're not going to let any more of them in. So if you were from Southern or Eastern Europe, sure, we classified you as white, but guess what? You're not good enough to be here anyway. You're not a good enough white person. So that's one of those times where this racism that develops turned the tables and affected whites in a negative way. This is the way they did it. They set up a quota system that said, we'll allow a certain number of people in the country each year, and the percentages of those people will be based on the percentage of the ones that are in the country today. So let's just say 3% of the American population was Italian. That means next year, 3% of the people we'll allow into the country will be Italian. 5% of the people are Russian. 5% of the people we'll allow will be Russian. So what they did, they looked and they said, wait a minute. We have to change this. And they went back and they changed the law. Instead of using the most current census data, which was 1920, they went all the way back to 1880. Before many of those Southern and Eastern Europeans had come to the country. And they used their percentages in the population at that time, which shrunk down their percentages moving forward. And that was the law of the land until the 1960s. Imagine that. Imagine that. Laws are created to advantage people. Social construction of race has convinced many of us that people really are different based on skin color, hair texture, and other outward physical characteristics. We saw earlier how much of a myth that is. Biologically, think of it this way. They've mapped the human genome. They found that we have somewhere around 30,000 genes, each of us, 30,000. Yet, only a handful of those have an impact on how we physically look. Only a handful of them have an impact on our skin color, our hair texture. Just a handful out of 30,000. Yet these handful, these small number, we use to judge people. Imagine that. Out of 30,000 genes, we use just a handful to determine life outcomes of people. It's craziness when you think about it. The social construction of race has normalized inequality by convincing us that certain races are by nature inferior to whites. You saw, guys, earlier, the idea that blacks would become extinct. This was talked about far and wide in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. People were predicting that blacks would be extinct within a short period of time. People were predicting that by 1920, there'd be no black people left. They'd all die off because they were inferior. Imagine that. Did any of you guys learn that in history class? Did your history teachers tell you that in history class? Probably not. And you know why they didn't tell you? Because they didn't know. So here we have a group who people said are so inferior that they're going to die off eventually. There will be none of them left. They even said for many, many years, mulattoes, which the term comes from mule, and we all know, maybe some of you don't know, a mule cannot have a baby. Do you guys know that? A mule is sterile. It cannot have a child. They believed for many years that if a black person and a white person had a child together, that child would be sterile. For many years, this was the belief people had. And then I guess eventually they start seeing these people having babies. Oh, I guess they're not sterile. We got to stop calling them mules. But for many years, that's what people felt. And so we look at this and we recognize that it's kind of crazy the way we see race, but it's so deeply embedded, so deeply entrenched in us that we simply believe that by nature certain people have certain characteristics. The social construction of race has convinced whites to see themselves as superior to non-whites. Your silly little girl was distraught that she was going to become black. She's 4 years old and she already knows. You learn this at a very early age. There was a study done at Harvard University about 5 years ago. And what they did was they looked at how early of an age we learn to think in racial terms. How early of an age we look to see advantages or disadvantages based on who we are as people. And they found that white children, black children, Asian children, everybody, typically by the age of 3, had learned enough about race that they knew whether their group was advantaged or disadvantaged. By the age of 3, you already know. By the age of 3. And why is it that you learn that at such a young age? Not because that's what my parents taught me. People always say that, well, the parents will stop teaching their kids this. That's not because of the parents. In many cases, the parents say nothing. All they have to do is open their eyes and see the world around them. You know how inquisitive children are? We know the kids are the nosiest people in the world. They want to know everything. And they notice things. They're very perceptive. They notice things and they point things out to us. They say things that we think are very funny, but when we think about it, like, this kid is pretty smart to notice that. I didn't even notice it and they noticed it. So by the age of 3, the typical American child has already learned to be advantaged or disadvantaged based on how they look. That little 4-year-old girl knew already. The social construction of race has allowed the advantage of whiteness to grow exponentially while slowing down or stopping growth for non-whites. Give you guys a really good example. You know, we tend to think as Americans, because we've heard this so many times, that a majority of the disadvantages blacks have economically go back to the days of slavery. Some of them do. But it's not as if things have been great since slavery ended. I'll give you an example of a program that was created. And it was used in such a way that it caused blacks to have social disadvantages, economic disadvantages. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the federal government created the Social Security Act, which meant that people could now begin to put money away into the Social Security program so that when they got older, they'd have some money for retirement. Okay? They also created...
May I have your attention, please? The library is closing promptly at 8 o'clock. If you have materials to check out
20 minutes.
or copies to pay for, please do so now. Thank you.
The federal government also created another program, unemployment insurance. And unemployment insurance was designed to help any American who had lost their job and wanted to have some type of means to support themselves until they were able to find another job. Now, these programs, when you look back on them, when you study them in history class and you heard about them in civics class, they were seemingly colorblind programs because they never tell you how the programs are implemented. This is what happened. You guys heard of the Dixiecrats before? Mm-hmm. The Dixiecrats were a group of Southern political leaders who were in the Senate who basically wanted to maintain their system of Jim Crow. This was when the Civil Rights Movement was starting. Blacks were fighting against segregation, and so this group of Southern senators got together and wrote a manifesto that basically drew out what they felt were the reasons Jim Crow segregation should continue moving forward. It should not end. Okay? So these same Southern senators, many of them had been in Congress for many years. When the Great Depression happened, when these laws, the Social Security Act, the act to give people unemployment insurance were written, the Senate was controlled by Southern Democrats. Okay? Now, what they did is they said, now wait a minute. We want to make sure that these programs do not benefit blacks. They came right out and said it. So when they wrote that act for Social Security, they said that it specifically applies to every occupation with the exception of 2. Domestic workers and farm workers. At that time, 85% of the black people in America were domestic workers or farm workers.